All right, everybody, thank you for joining FEMA's public comment webinar for version 3 of the National Disaster Recovery Framework. Hello, everyone. As a quick introduction, my name is Stephanie Marks. I use she, her pronouns. I'm wearing a black collared shirt and I'm sitting in my home office, and I would like to thank you all for joining us today. I will be presenting today's webinar with Joanne Lucas from the FEMA NDRF team.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joanne. I also use she, her pronouns. I'm wearing a white collared shirt with the FEMA logo. I've got black glasses and black curly hair. I'm sitting in my home office. Thanks, Stephanie.
All right. So we'd like to kick off today's conversation by talking about some of the logistics. So today's presentation is taking place on Zoom, and a recorded version of this presentation will be made available on FEMA's YouTube channel. Please use the Zoom Q&A feature to submit any questions that you have. This event is being interpreted into American Sign Language and will be captioned in English. For English captioning, please select the button that says More, then Captions, and then Show Captions. Our ASL interpreter will be on camera, and her video is being pinned to the top of your screen and labeled ASL Interpreter. And again, if you'd like to see captions on Zoom, please select More, followed by Captions, and then Show Captions. If you have any additional questions after today's webinar, please email them to the FEMA Recovery Interagency Coordination Division inbox listed here. We will also be dropping this email address into the chat for everyone to see. So today's agenda includes a welcome and meeting purpose, a National Disaster Recovery Framework, or NDRF, overview. We'll review the 2024 NDRF partner engagement process. We'll review key updates to the document and give individual chapter overviews. We'll go over the public comment instructions, and then we'll end with some closing remarks. And now I'd like to turn it back over to Joanne for some opening remarks.
All right. Well, again, welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're really excited to walk you through the updated National Disaster Recovery Framework. I wanted to start by expressing our gratitude to everyone who has contributed thus far, and we appreciate your feedback in advance. As we begin, I do want to emphasize the importance of your feedback during this session. In a moment, you'll hear Stephanie talk about the extensive engagement we've undertaken across the recovery community to gather input. And this feedback has been essential to enhancing the framework, making it more accessible, written in plain language, and adaptable to SLTT recovery efforts. So while this framework is not operational in nature, it does aim to clearly outline how the federal government provides disaster recovery support. It highlights how collaboration across the entire recovery community can be effectively achieved, and it offers guidance on how communities can best organize themselves to utilize the resources available from both federal and non-governmental entities. The NDRF version you'll see provides activities recommended to conduct before and after disasters, and some other things that we will walk through. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Stephanie to kick things off.
Thanks, Joanne. As mentioned, the purpose of today's meeting is to provide an overview of the updated National Disaster Recovery Framework and walk through the process of how you can provide comments and feedback during the public comment period. The public comment period allows participants to provide recommended edits and input about how FEMA can best update and revise the framework ahead of its final publication date. This process is designed to present the current draft to anyone who may have an interest in it, and the FEMA team welcomes feedback on any of the content. We are especially looking for input on how to make this document as useful and helpful as possible to recovery practitioners. We are requesting your participation to make this document a comprehensive, inclusive, and community-driven National Disaster Recovery Framework. All right, so we'll begin with a brief overview of the National Preparedness System and the National Disaster Recovery Framework itself. So a little bit of background for everyone about the National Preparedness System. As many of you may be aware, in 2011, President Obama signed Presidential Policy Directive 8, which required the creation of a national preparedness goal, as well as the national preparedness system that outlines the processes necessary to achieve that goal. The currently published national preparedness goal reads, a secure and resilient nation with the capabilities required across the whole community to prevent, protect against, mitigate, respond to, and recover from the threats and hazards that pose the greatest risk. The goal identifies 5 mission areas under which all the various preparedness activities are organized. Those mission areas are prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. The goal also outlines the core capabilities necessary for the execution of each of these mission areas. Each one of the mission areas has its own framework, which outlines the strategy and doctrine for how the whole community can coordinate and deliver on the respective core capabilities associated with that mission area. Disaster recovery is one of these 5 mission areas. As a federal framework, the NDRF describes how the nation mobilizes for disaster recovery. It's intended to serve as a high-level document with follow-on operational plans to be developed in the future. Now I'd like to talk about the document's purpose and audience. The NDRF outlines the federal government's approach for providing disaster recovery resources and support, and describes high-level disaster recovery roles and responsibilities. State, local, tribal, and territorial governments, or SLTTs, may use the federal structure described in the NDRF as a model to guide and inform their own disaster recovery planning and policymaking. The guiding principle of the NDRF is that disaster recovery is most successful when it's organized around community-driven and locally defined goals that promote equitable and resilient outcomes. This guiding principle applies to both pre- and post-disaster activities and recognizes that intergovernmental and cross-sector collaboration is crucial for developing recovery strategies and projects that help achieve the disaster recovery goals of SLTT partners. The NDRF is primarily written for SLTT officials who lead and coordinate disaster recovery efforts, holding the responsibility of guiding their community's recovery. But it's also valuable for recovery practitioners at all levels, whether they serve in a formal or informal role during disasters. Disaster recovery practitioners include full-time professionals like state and county emergency managers or a local superintendent of schools, as well as individuals from across the whole community. A little bit about the scope of the document. As a national framework, the NDRF provides an overview of various disaster recovery roles and responsibilities and empowers SLTTs to plan and lead their own recovery operations effectively and equitably. The NDRF explains how the federal government supports disaster-affected SLTTs as they recover and describes federal and non-governmental recovery resources that may be available to them under federal declarations. The NDRF model can be applied across a broad range of disasters, including Stafford Act declarations, agency declarations, and presidentially directed disaster recovery support, such as through executive order or presidential memorandum. Now I'll provide an overview of the process used this year to engage partners across the whole community and solicit their input on what changes they think would help improve the framework. A little more backstory here on partner engagement. The latest draft of the NDRF was published in 2016. Back in 2021 to 2022, FEMA undertook efforts to begin updating the NDRF, but these efforts did not actually result in a published updated draft. At the beginning of this current revision effort, the FEMA project team looked back at all of the partner feedback that had been gathered during that 2021 to 2022 effort and identified 5 themes that partners consistently cited as needing updates. First is recovery structure, so more clearly defining the audience for the NDRF and incorporating an understanding of transitions across the recovery continuum, as well as how partnering agencies are structured to work together on recovery efforts. Next was roles and responsibilities. So very clearly outlining what federal capabilities are available to support SLTT partners in their recovery efforts, clearly defining the federal recovery support functions, and just better articulating roles and responsibilities across the disaster recovery continuum. Capacity and resources, outlining what resources are available to help SLTT partners build their recovery capacity, both pre-disaster and during disaster recovery efforts. Planning, so providing an adaptable framework for recovery planning. And finally, data and metrics, identifying how to leverage data to inform recovery planning and track recovery progress. At the onset of the current 2024 effort, FEMA and the National Security Council established a co-chaired NDRF steering committee to oversee the revision process. The steering committee established the structure, audience, and scope of the NDRF, along with providing real-world examples of past recovery missions and guiding decisions about the content of each chapter. FEMA also convened a series of NDRF working groups and partner engagement listening sessions with partners across the whole community to gather their thoughts and insights into what would make the NDRF a useful document. Participants for these sessions included tribal nations, state, local, and territorial governments, nonprofit and non-governmental organizations, and private sector partners. Between March and September of 2024, FEMA conducted 57 total partner engagement sessions, including 13 steering committee meetings, 28 working group meetings, 3 tribal nations working group meetings, 2 tribal nations consultations, 1 quarterly tribal association meeting, and 10 partner engagement listening sessions. In total, FEMA engaged over 175 participants throughout these sessions. The steering committee is made up of 18 members across 10 different federal agencies, representing the 6 federal recovery support functions, or RSFs. The NDRF working group was made up of 96 members from federal agencies, state, territorial, and local governments, and non-governmental organizations. FEMA also sought feedback from tribal nations. FEMA's tribal consultation policy identifies consultations as the official process for communicating and collaborating with federally recognized Indian tribal governments and Alaska Native corporations to exchange information, receive input, and consider their views on actions that have tribal implications. In addition to the tribal consultation process, FEMA held 3 tribal working group sessions that engaged 6 different tribal nations to solicit input and feedback on the NDRF revision from tribal recovery practitioners. FEMA also held 10 listening sessions with partners identified by the NDRF writing team, steering committee, and working group members. Participants in these sessions used their subject matter expertise to answer questions about the 5 themes FEMA identified: recovery structure, roles and responsibilities, capacity and resources, planning, and data and metrics, as well as answer questions about how the NDRF could best support them in achieving their organization's recovery goals. These sessions included representatives from 15 different federal agencies, 21 state and local government organizations, 5 territories, 28 non-governmental organizations, voluntary organizations active in disasters and long-term recovery groups, and 4 professional, network, and business and industry partners. So throughout the working groups and partner engagement sessions, FEMA heard a lot of feedback from practitioners across a spectrum of recovery operations. This feedback included that the NDRF should be simple, it should use plain, accessible language and explain recovery concepts that have many moving parts. The writers should be aware that recovery partners may be more familiar with recovery programs like public assistance and individual assistance, and less familiar with the NDRF itself as a tool or a resource. And it should use examples throughout the document to demonstrate recovery concepts in action. We also heard that the NDRF should focus on targeting SLTT partners. To do that, it should consider the unique needs of individual communities, and emphasize that recovery is locally led and community driven, and encourage frequent and consistent communication among recovery partners to build trust in relationships both during disaster recovery and before disaster strikes. The draft should respect tribal nation sovereignty and acknowledge the federal government's treaty and trust responsibilities. And partners also recommended that recovery stakeholders should be made aware of the revisions to the updated draft so that they'll know how it applies to them. Finally, partners recommended that the NDRF should identify additional sources of information, and that would include providing guidance on both pre and post-disaster planning and resources that are available, and sharing information on recovery resources, including contributions from business and industry that can help SLTTs build capacity and address resource gaps. As you review and consider providing feedback on the draft NDRF, we ask that you keep these goals in mind and consider if you feel like they have been effectively achieved. So now I'm going to hand it over to Joanne to review the key updates made to the new NDRF draft, including a high-level look at each of the chapters.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. So let's dive in. At a high level, you're going to see the updated NDRF identifies the primary audience as state, local, tribal, and territorial officials, and it underscores that SLTTs are the leaders and organizers within their communities. It also emphasizes that recovery operations are complex and interdependent, and we note the increasing frequency and severity of disasters. We also highlight that disaster recovery planning provides a critical opportunity to rebuild in a resilient and sustainable manner. So, this version includes discussions on pre and post disaster planning best practices that SLTT partners should consider. And it also prioritizes the importance of equity and inclusion throughout recovery for effective planning. The updated NDRF details the federal recovery support function structure and its roles in supporting local recovery goals. You'll also find updated graphics to show recoveries integrated with response, planning, and mitigation efforts. And lastly, the updated framework uses real-world examples as well as executive summaries to illustrate recovery successes and lessons learned. So there are a total of 5 chapters. In chapter 1, we explain the primary audience is SLTT officials, but it's also valuable for recovery practitioners at all levels. And this is important to highlight because identifying the federal government's approach to recovery support still focuses on the importance of community-driven and locally defined goals, which ultimately enhances effective collaboration among federal agencies and SLTT partners. In Chapter 1, we also clarify the intent of the NDRF is to explain the federal government's approach for providing disaster recovery resources and support. It also identifies that recovery is most successful when it's organized around community-driven and locally defined goals that are promoting equitable and resilient outcomes. And finally, it establishes that the NDRF is a model that can be applied across a broad range of disasters and not just those that receive a federal disaster declaration. Chapter 2 provides a high-level summary of the complexities of disaster recovery. And this is important because understanding the complex disaster recovery environment and the meaningful roles of local entities helps support all parts of what we call the recovery continuum. So the recovery continuum concept reinforces the idea that the life cycle of a disaster isn't linear. It's rather a cyclical, interdependent process where response, rebuilding, and mitigation often overlap or they're happening at the same time. And you'll see one of the graphics in this chapter illustrate that concept. Chapter 2 also identifies that communities take the lead in determining their disaster recovery timelines, but there's considerations for program-specific federal support deadlines. And so the updated draft supports some pre and post disaster recovery planning activities that enable communities to establish their own priorities, define goals, identify projects in areas of importance, and identify mitigation opportunities to build resilience against future threats and hazards. And it recognizes that measuring and communicating progress throughout disaster recovery is vital, and it can be measured in multiple ways. In Chapter 3, this is where we provide an overview of the federal roles and responsibilities during disaster recovery, including highlighting key positions that are filled during recovery operations. Examples of those key positions include the Federal Coordinating Officer, a Federal Disaster Recovery Coordinator. We talk about interagency recovery coordination missions, as well as advisors. And this chapter aims to provide clearly defined roles and responsibilities to ensure that the whole recovery community understands how it is the federal government can collaborate with them to efficiently achieve local recovery goals. So, this chapter introduces the federal recovery support structure and then details the 6 federal recovery support functions, or RSFs, and they are community assistance, economic, health, education, and human services, housing, infrastructure systems, and natural and cultural resources. So you'll find detailed descriptions of the mission, desired strategic outcomes, and the responsibilities of each RSF, accompanied by real world examples of the RSF where they were activated for a recovery effort, just to highlight that RSF in action. And lastly, this chapter highlights that SLTT partners can use the information here to develop, adopt, or adapt their own recovery structures. So, chapter 4 is about state, local, tribal, nation, and territorial roles and responsibilities. So, identifying the critical roles that SLTTs play in disaster recovery. Notes that, SLTTs often rely on their own capacities and authorities are leading their own disaster recoveries. And this is important because while the federal government provides resources and expertise, additional support, SLTTs and disaster recovery practitioners are the ones responsible for organizing and executing recovery within their communities. So, this chapter identifies some best practices for SLTTs to consider implementing pre disaster, especially focusing on like planning, working with partners, and understanding recovery roles and responsibilities. And then you'll also find recommendations for post disaster activities that enable communities to establish and refine recovery priorities, identify critical projects, and take advantage of mitigation opportunities to improve community resilience against threats and hazards. And finally, in chapter 4, we provide some additional insight into local government, state, and territory, as well as tribal nation roles and responsibilities during disaster recovery. And then the last chapter, 5, is about non governmental resources. And it aims to identify those additional non governmental disaster recovery resources and opportunities for capacity building that may be available to SLTTs both pre and post disaster. This is really important because ensuring that communities are aware of all the potential resources for capacity building can help support communities in all parts of recovery. So, additional disaster recovery resources may be available, let's say, via voluntary organizations active in disasters, long-term recovery groups, nonprofit organizations, philanthropy, business and industry, and academia. And it encourages communities to explore these resources as early as possible to determine what assistance is available and how to access it. And lastly, it identifies that where available, these resources can provide a wide range of support, and it should be explored as SLTTs are developing and establishing their pre and post disaster recovery plans. And so the NDRF concludes with additional tools and information for the audience to access in the form of appendices. There's a total of 8. Appendix A, you can find some fact sheets that give a detailed description of each RSF. These serve as like a quick reference or tearaway sheet. Appendix B is just providing definitions for each acronym that's used in the document, as well as Appendix C that provides definitions for the technical terms used or referenced throughout the document. Appendix D includes some examples of pre and post disaster recovery planning activities, as well as strategies for measuring progress through data. Appendix E provides a list of digital resources that are related to recovery that might be helpful for recovery practitioners. Appendix F provides an overview of the National Preparedness Goal Core capabilities. And Appendix G is a section that includes high-level snapshots of how recovery partners have utilized the flexibility of the NDRF to structure their disaster recovery efforts and achieve the recovery goals of SLTT governments. And it does this by providing executive summaries of real-world recent disasters in East Palestine, Ohio, Maui, Hawaii, and Selma, Alabama. And then Appendix H just will include information on how the NDRF is going to be maintained and updated. So now I'll hand it back over to Stephanie to provide an overview of the public comment process.
Thanks, Joanne. So first off, we really want to emphasize the importance and value of the public comment process. This process is FEMA and the interagency's opportunity to present the current draft of the NDRF to all interested parties for review. We welcome your feedback on how to ensure the framework is as useful and effective as possible while maintaining its scope and purpose. We encourage you to provide comments on any of the sections that you feel are most relevant to your work, as well as the communities that you serve. And we also ask that you please share this information with any others who you think could offer valuable input. So the public engagement process is taking place from September 24th to October 23rd, 2024 on the FEMA.gov website. The draft NDRF is available online for review, and we'll be dropping the links into the Zoom chat for everyone as well. When you go to the website, you'll find a link to the draft itself, as well as a link to a downloadable comment matrix. Any feedback you would like to submit should be provided in the comment matrix and emailed with the subject line NDRF V3 public comment feedback to the FEMA Recovery ICD email address, which is FEMA-recovery-ICD-PDB@fema.dhs.gov. As comments are received from the public, they'll be compiled and reviewed by the FEMA team. Then at the conclusion of the comment period, the team will consider all proposed changes to the document. And after they have been fully adjudicated, the finalized NDRF draft will then be sent to FEMA and interagency leadership for final review and approval, after which it will be published on the FEMA website. If you have any questions about the NDRF or the public comment process, please email the FEMA Recovery ICD inbox. And with that, I will hand it back to Joanne to close us out.
Awesome. So we want to extend our gratitude for your time today, as well as your valuable insights and feedback on the revisions to the NDRF draft. Your thoughts and expertise are greatly appreciated as we continue to refine this and enhance the updated framework. So should you have any additional questions, as Stephanie said, please direct them to the Recovery ICD mailbox. Also, as Hurricane Helene response and recovery efforts unfold, we hope you are safe and well, and we thank those supporting those efforts. Thank you for your time today.